Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here and welcome to this TransCelerate webinar on understanding case reporting transmission networks in drug safety, the impact of replication. My name is Clint Cron and I support TransCelerate's drug safety and pharmacovigilance initiatives. I will be your moderator today. Today we will begin with a few logistics and ground rules, followed by a brief overview of TransCelerate and the intelligent automation opportunities in pharmacovigilance initiative. Our presenters will then offer background into the replication concept for individual case safety reports, or ICSRs. That will be followed by results from their ICSR transmission study and a broader industry impact assessment. We will then move into a discussion with our expert panelists, followed by a Q&A session with both panelists and presenters. Now a few logistics. All participants will be muted for this call. You may reduce the control panel for a better presentation view. You may submit questions for our panelists or presenters by typing your question and clicking the send button as seen here. Please ensure your questions are relevant to the topics of ICSR transmission and replication, and please indicate if your question is for a specific panelist or presenter. Finally, please be aware that this webinar may be recorded in whole or in part. Please take a moment to download the handout for this webinar by navigating to the Handouts feature on your control panel as shown here. The handout contains links to the content we will discuss today and other related resources. And now for a brief overview of TransCelerate. TransCelerate is a not-for-profit entity created to foster collaboration. Our mission is to collaborate across the global biopharmaceutical R&D community to identify, prioritize, design, and facilitate the implementation of solutions designed to drive the efficient, effective, and high-quality delivery of new medicines. TransCelerate's collaboration is worldwide. Since inception, we have prioritized robust collaboration with key stakeholders across the R&D ecosystem, including global health authorities, data providers, industry consortia, and others. Please visit our website where you will find solutions available in English and additional languages. The research you will hear about today has been part of a larger TransCelerate journey to identify how intelligent automation technologies can be used to support the execution of pharmacovigilance activities and processes. Please refer to your handout for links to this TransCelerate initiative and its solutions. We want to thank the authors who contributed directly to this research on ICSR replication, including Andrew Bate, Brian Dreyfus, Anju Garg, Kate Goffman, Roman Hock, Manfred Hauben, Vijay Kara, Marcus Krupp, John Van Stecklenburg, and Ulrich Vogel. The team was also supported by our workstream leader, Neil Grabowski. Today, two of these authors will be presenting their findings. John Van Stecklenburg is Senior Director of Methods and Analysis at Janssen, the pharmaceutical companies of Johnson & Johnson. John is a longtime TransCelerate contributor and led the sub-team that conducted this study. He also served as the corresponding author for this publication. Vijay Kara is Director of Safety and Quantitative Innovation, Safety Innovation and Analytics for Global Safety at GSK. Vijay was one of the principal contributors to the study methodology, including the data collection plan, and he contributed heavily to the publication. And now over to John and Vijay.
Thank you, Clint. And I'll be introducing the topic of the paper that was published last year in Drug Safety. The topic is around the replication of individual case safety reports. So let's start with very basic things. We're talking about prescription medicines here. And of course, the goal of prescription medicines is to have a therapeutic effect, but they can also have occasionally adverse events. And regulators have a responsibility to monitor the safety of the products approved in their countries or regions. And the marketing authorization holders, the pharma companies, have a responsibility to monitor the safety of products that they market worldwide. So how is that done? The bedrock of that system is still the individual case safety report, which is basically a formal way of saying a report around an adverse event. The question that we wanted to answer is, these case reports, they are shared between various parties, and those parties may look at those reports multiple times. They can see different versions of those. So we know that there are multiple recipients. They can be re-reported to additional recipients. The net result is that those cases describing adverse events will reside with different lag times in various places, in multiple databases owned by pharma companies or by multinational regulatory bodies or individual regulators, partner companies, etc. And the net result, we suspect, is that each case is repeatedly looked at, processed, assessed in terms of causality, labeledness, etc., by multiple stakeholders. That concept we named replication. And going back to the graph in the middle, if you see in the middle there, the blue box, it says an adverse event occurs to a patient in some country A. That is the basis of an ICSR. That can go different ways. If you follow some of the arrows, it could take multiple pathways. The patient experiencing the AE, the adverse event, could report that directly to the MAH, the company, the marketing authorization holder, who is then usually obliged to report it to the national competent authority in that country. It could also be that a healthcare professional becomes aware of that same adverse event and reports it to the national competent authority that may then forward it to other parties. For example, the WHO Vijay. If you follow that, Vijay then can also serve other marketing authorization holders as a source of adverse event information. So they may extract cases from that database. So that would be the initial awareness of that adverse event. It usually comes to the marketing authorization holder. They have, depending on their marketing status of the product, they have various obligations to health authorities, to regulators. They may be required to report that to the EMA. They may be required to report it to the FDA or the Korean Health Authority or the MHRA. For co-marketed products, very often the partner company will have to be notified with the same information. So that is there symbolized in that box with the oval around it. So that is what we call primary transmission. When it arrives at the marketing authorization holder, this report, it will be sent to multiple recipients. Literature cases, which are there's a symbol on the upper left, they take yet another path, but also usually end up in multiple databases. Before we started the formal project, a quick assessment in one of the participating TransCelerate companies, asking the question, if you look at some of your reports, how many recipients, how many destinations does a particular ICSR go to? So that is shown in the table on the right. That is definitely a sort of a high end of the distribution, but it's not uncommon to have a particular case, an ICSR, being sent to 20, here you can see 26, 27 recipients, and that is just the first transmission. Before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to explain the concept of replication. That means a single report or a single occurrence of an adverse event being multiplied and residing in multiple, being replicated in multiple databases. That is different from the concept that many of the PV experts here on the call probably are more familiar with, which is duplication. That means an MAH or a health authority receive the same report, but maybe twice or 3 times from multiple parties, from the treating physician, from the patient itself, or from a partner company. That is a completely different concept and not the focus of the study that we will be presenting here. Go to the next slide. So 2 years ago, we set out with the initial goal to quantify the extent of this phenomenon of replication, because it was unknown how many of initial recipients and further recipients received these ICSRs. There were no published data around that. So the goal was to quantify and also to characterize replication. So in which areas, in which types of reports get replicated more than others. There was actually, in addition to the primary goal, to estimate the quantity of replication through primary transmission, meaning reports sent to the MAHs, a stretch goal was to actually see if we could follow these ICSRs beyond the first transmission. So what happens to a report that gets sent from an MAH to the FDA? There will be further sharing or sending, etc. So that was a stretch goal. We did have some tentative approaches to create what you see in the lower right there, this network model, but the focus really of the paper was on the left side, to quantify the number of recipients of these ICSRs. If we go to the next slide, we will be moving over to my colleague Vijay from GSK, who will be going through the results. Thank you.
Vijay, you're muted.
Thank you, John, for providing us with an overview of replication. As a recap, replication is when an adverse event report resides in multiple different databases, which is different to duplication, which is when the same report is replicated multiple times within a single database. The ICSR transmission paper is a peer-reviewed article which aggregates data across 7 TransCelerate member companies. The data of the 7 member TransCelerate companies accounts for 20% of the total volume of data in the FDA FAERS database. Hence, we believe that the trends we are likely to see are generalizable across industry. The total volume of data covered in our analysis accounts for 2.5 million case versions across 7.6 million health authority submissions worldwide. The graph on the right-hand side represents figure 5 from the publication. On the x-axis, you have the number of recipients, i.e. the total number of health authorities who received a case version. And on the y-axis, you have the total percentage of case versions. From this graph, we derive 2 key points. The first is the average number of recipients per case version is 3 across all cases and 4 across serious unlisted cases. The second is that there is a long-tail distribution, and whilst most cases are submitted to less than 10 recipients, the percentage of case versions submitted to more than 10 recipients is not insignificant. It accounts for approximately 12% of case versions, but that's an astonishing 40% of all of the submissions made. At this point, you may be asking yourself the same question that we did as a team, which is, if a case version is on average sent to 3 to 4 health authorities, is it the same health authorities each time? And if so, could we coordinate an effort to reduce replication? If we could move to the next slide. As a post hoc analysis, 3 member companies looked at the combination of 3 recipients. And what we noted is presented in table 2 of the publication. Typically, it's not the same 3 recipients, and the combination of recipients is heavily influenced by the marketing authorizations held by the member companies for their respective products. Next slide, please. So far, what we have seen is that across the 7 member companies, a huge volume of cases and their respective versions are distributed to multiple recipients, highlighting the magnitude of replication. Secondary to this, we set about highlighting the potential implication of replication, and one measure shown here, which is figure 6 from the publication, is entitled submission selectivity. Here on the x-axis, you have report version number, and on the y-axis, submission selectivity. Submission selectivity is the divergence relative to the highest version number. The example here is Health Authority 1 received from the MAH versions 1, 3, and 4, and Health Authority 2 received versions 1, 2, and 4. Based on reporting rules, the MAH in this example has 6 versions in their database, therefore 2 versions are missing from the Health Authority databases respectively. The higher the submission selectivity, the greater the divergence between the marketing authorization holder and the Health Authority. From this graph, we note that the variation from report 3 is around 20%, clustering at around 30% for higher case versions. What this translates to is a mismatch between versions of a case within a Health Authority database compared to a marketing authorization holder. This mismatch increases with case version number. If we can move to the next slide. This paper provides the first quantification of the phenomenon of ICSR replication across Health Authority and marketing authorization holder safety databases. Due especially to the significant efforts of the participating member companies to aggregate the safety data from across their many repositories, it also represents the first of its kind illustration of the incomplete and diverging case information that can exist across data repositories. It should provide a thought-provoking for the wider PV community, reigniting conversation about the value of replicated ICSRs-related activities and the impact on patient safety, and promoting discussion about mitigating regulatory, contractual, and technical approaches. So thank you for listening, and I'll hand back over to John.
Okay, thank you, Vijay. So we actually finished the paper and this presentation with some thoughts for discussion. So obviously what we demonstrated was there is a significant level of replication of these ICSRs associated then with, multiple parties repeating the same processes and potentially even coming to different conclusions. So is the general concept of transmitting cases, is that really of these times? We have big data, modern technologies. Can something else be envisioned in terms of alternative approaches for collecting and sharing these drug safety reports? So one of the ideas we briefly discussed in the paper is the potential of a single fee-based institution. So the big advantage is that when marketing authorization holders, that are usually the first recipients, they would book in, take up and maintain cases on that platform. The biggest advantage being is there is one canonical version of an ICSR that is available to various parties that of course need the appropriate read, write access, etc., based on their status, whether they be health authorities, partners, or others. In addition to having one canonical version, which prevents a lot of potential differences in processing and interpretation, it also provides economies of scale and thus the ability to do these modern, to exploit these modern technologies by AI, LLMs, etc. In addition to which, these single or at least single fee-based, they may be distributed databases could also provide advantages in quantitative and qualitative signal detection. All the information is essentially in one large place for all products with the appropriate access to the various stakeholders, MAHs and authorities. So with that thought-provocative proposal, we'll leave you and we'll move over to the panel discussion and questions.
Thanks very much to John and Vijay for their presentation. And we will now move into our panel discussion. First, we have a brief disclaimer to show you. And while we give everyone a moment to read it, we'll remind you that you may submit your questions for our panelists by typing in your question and clicking the send button. Please do indicate if your question is for a specific panelist, and please ensure if your questions are relevant to the topics of ICSR transmission and replication. We will begin by asking our expert panelists to introduce themselves and describe their roles within the respective organizations. We'll start with you, Florence.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Florence van Hunsel. I'm a pharmacist and an epidemiologist working at the Netherlands Pharmacovigilance Center, Lareb. We are the organization that maintains the spontaneous reporting database in the Netherlands. I have been there for 18 years. The last 10 years, I was responsible for the signal detection process. But since 2023, I'm leading our safety innovation. So that's my introduction.
On to you next, Phil.
Thanks, Clint, and a pleasure to be here and to be able to join you. So my name is Phil Tregunno. I'm Deputy Director of Patient Safety Monitoring at the MHRA, which comprises all of our activities around spontaneous reporting, both from healthcare professionals, patients, and through pharmaceutical industry, and also our approaches to signal detection systems that we use for transmission and retransmission of data. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Unfortunately, David Lewis was unable to join us this morning, so we will skip over him and we'll move on to our study sponsor, that's Andrew Bate.
Hi everyone, great pleasure to be here. Enjoy this exciting session so far. My name is Andrew Bate. I'm Head of Safety Innovation and Analytics at GSK, where I'm responsible for driving forward next generation thoughts around pharmacovigilance capabilities. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. And Andrew, we'll stick with you for this this next panel question. The question is, how did this project come to fruition? And in your role as the project sponsor, what aspects of ICSR replication are you most passionate about?
Thank you for the question. Thinking back, how did it come to fruition? Well, I think those of us in TransCelerate and beyond all have a common appreciation that pharmacovigilance constantly needs to strive to develop, to focus on patient safety ever better. And I think in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways, things haven't changed enormously since the birth of pharmacovigilance in the 60s. There's more data, there's more complexity, there's more ability through technologies to share data, etc., etc. But I think it's really a responsibility of all of us in pharmacovigilance to constantly question what we're doing and why we're doing it for patient safety. Are we really focusing on the aspects of the pharmacovigilance systems that allow us to strive to do ever better for patient safety? And I think as part of that, a key question then is, to enable that focus, are there activities that have just kind of evolved that maybe have less direct impact on patient safety? And I think that's really where this came from, was that TransCelerate is a fantastically exciting organization in terms of many member companies and many of the very largest pharmaceutical companies, full of people who are very innovative and interested in pursuing how we can do things better and doing methodological research. And the question came up, well, this idea of, we were all, I think, in the field comfortable with this being a norm, that there is replication, as John and Vijay were saying, but it hadn't been quantified before. And we felt that if we could quantify it, which might be a possibility across many member companies in a way that was probably almost a unique capability, this would provide an opportunity, A, to get a sense of the issue, but then to start maybe having some discussions about whether things could be done more effectively for patient safety moving forwards. So I think that's where it came from. A clear question that hadn't been addressed before, so very novel, that one individual organization was going to struggle to address, and we could really use the power of TransCelerate to collaborate to look at this question. In terms of what I'm passionate about, I'm passionate about the fact that we are striving to quantify a novel problem and therefore the opportunity to strive to do things better and to think about whether there's some creative solutions and how we could think about how we optimally handle ICSRs and other data streams moving forwards.
Thanks, Andrew. Phil, this next question is for you. The question is, the study investigated primary ICSR transmission from marketing authorization holders to regulators. In your opinion, is it worthwhile investigating secondary ICSR transmission? And are you familiar with any complex requirements driving the secondary transmission of ICSRs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a few different parts of this that I'd like to pick up. I mean, I think first of all, the paper has been incredibly helpful from my perspective in understanding levels of replication in databases. And of course, replication leads to retransmission, which is the key point here. I think one part that perhaps wasn't touched on was that in retransmission, because we all have different data protection rules and different parameters that we have to comply to in relation to what elements we can transmit. When you see those different versions being transmitted around the world, they very often have different data elements withheld from within them. And therefore, it's not just the different versions that are retransmitted, as being highlighted and discussed, that will be challenging, but there may be very different levels of data and decreasing amounts of data for signal detection purposes as the case gets retransmitted. To give a couple of examples, I think first of all, starting from our perspective as a health authority at the MHRA, we will receive reports from patients, from healthcare professionals. We have obligations to transmit those to the pharmaceutical industry. This piece of work, is largely based, this paper is largely based around companies that have mainly innovative products. We see significantly higher levels of replication when we're thinking about things like generic products. And even where there are good initiatives in place, such as EMA's literature monitoring service, we still see significant levels of replication for slightly different reasons. Now, so from our perspective at MHRA, were we to receive a report for paracetamol, then there are 200 companies that we are required to send that information to, and they may or may not need to retransmit that data to other health authorities as a result. So you can see that if then those 200 companies also had onward reporting obligations to a proportion of countries, then there would be even higher levels of replication when those reports arrive, for instance, at the FDA or at the EMA or other global authorities. Conversely, even where there are good initiatives in place, such as literature monitoring from EMA, EMA makes those ICSRs available to companies. Those companies will then all send them to us as a third country regulator. And so we've had to implement specific strategies to prevent us from retransmitting that data onward to all of the companies. And indeed, we have seen instances where the case version of an ICSR gets in excess of 100 purely because of retransmission between different partners, which causes significant problems from a database perspective, but also wastes significant time from a signal detection perspective. So we'll come on to talk probably about opportunities for improvement down the line, but I'd certainly endorse that this is a very significant problem.
Thanks very much, Phil. This next question, I'm going to ask Andrew to pinch hit for Dave on this. The question is, how much of a problem do you think replication is for your organization and for the PV ecosystem in general?
I think it's a huge problem for all organizations, and Phil was just talking about that. I mean, it's not just the fact that you end up with the same report in lots of different places, but that you have variable information in the versions of reports. So it may even be hard sometimes to identify whether it is indeed the same report that's been replicated or a different report. And I think that's the challenge, is that what we all want to do is identify the reports as soon as possible that might show an emerging safety issue that can be analysed and acted upon appropriately as quickly as possible. And the more noise, the more variability, timings of when reports are entered into different databases, versions, different follow-up versions ending up in different places, adds more and more complexity and noise to the system, and therefore risks and makes it harder to focus on those novel reports that can really impact benefit risk that we need to identify as quickly as possible. Remembering also, of course, that those of us who work with spontaneous reports all the time are used to the fact that we have lots of missing data, that there will be non-random missing data. So there's already challenges enough in how we best analyze this sort of data without this additional problem on top of it as well.
Thanks, Andrew. There's some of that passion we talked about earlier. This next question is for you, Florence. Florence, in your experience, what is the greatest problem with ICSR transmission that impacts your understanding of benefit risk?
Thanks for the question. I think a lot has been said already. Let me just start by saying that I think the paper itself is really important, and well, I'm very happy that it is out in drug safety, and very happy that Vijay and John presented it so well. But what I got from it the most is that in pharmacovigilance, what we ultimately want is to benefit patient safety. And I think reading this paper and listening to the presentation, we are doing, it takes so much effort to send these reports, which have very limited effect on, a portion of them have very limited effect on risk-benefit analysis. So are we actually putting our efforts on the right things? Are we doing things that essentially will better patient safety? And I think maybe we could think about well, ways to put our efforts on other things than replicating reports that are not always so useful for patient safety.
Thank you, Florence. This next question will be for all three of the panelists, and Florence, we'll start with you. The question is, should we reconsider the way safety information is transmitted throughout the world? In other words, what might it look like if we were to redesign how we share safety data worldwide?
Yeah, I think by reading the paper that we should rethink how we are doing things, and maybe a low-hanging fruit would be to look at, for instance, the literature reports that are replicated a lot, and that will take us a lot of effort to replicate and to look at in different ways. And I think if I would start somewhere, I would look at sending those reports to different organizations and rethink on how we could do that. But that's, I think, is a very low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of other things that we could think about.
Thanks, Florence. How about you, Phil? What would you say to that?
Yeah, it is really important when we look at this, and for a number of reasons. Firstly, timing, and if you think that each stakeholder that receives a serious ICSR has 15 days to handle that case and then transmit it on. If you look at the pace of uptake awareness of potential safety issues, look at the pandemic, look at COVID-19 vaccines, and look at how quickly assessments needed to be made in those situations. Were we to be in a situation where data was received by a health authority and it didn't make it to another health authority because it had to go via a marketing authorization holder, and that took 30 days or 45 days, depending on the number of stakeholders involved, we'd be in a very difficult position collectively. And we have had to look at how we can manage this situation better to address specific issues during the pandemic. So there is absolutely both, I think, a will and a need to do better in this space. There's opportunities probably more immediately in terms of things like reducing retransmission of replicated cases, and I think there are steps that we can take on a pragmatic basis to avoid retransmission and hopefully avoid large levels of duplication or ICSR replication in other databases. And I think we can look collectively at reporting rules to ensure that we have access to appropriate data. But as the paper very carefully highlights, there are also more optimal opportunities in terms of single sources of truth, potential for use of blockchain, and ability to have much more clearly demarked individual reports.
Thanks, Phil. Andrew?
Yeah, I agree with the comments from Florence about, are there some low-hanging fruits that we can pick off as a community? I think technological solutions like blockchain are things that make sense to think about. I guess my plea for us as a field really is top-down thinking as well. I think often in pharmacovigilance, we add an extra layer or consider thinking about doing something as well as what we're doing before. And I think what we all have in common is the need for identifying as early as possible adverse events that might change our thinking around a medicinal product, vaccine, and being able to analyze it and act on it appropriately as fast as possible. That's true of pharmaceutical companies, that's true of regulators, that's true of other organizations as well. And I think, how do we top-down think about how do we make it available? How do we make data available to the people who need to see the data in the most effective way to ensure that when those reports occur, that they can be analyzed appropriately? And which are the reports, and how do we focus or defocus, if you will, reports that have less chance, that because of the aspects of the data on there, because of the nature of the knownness of the adverse drug reaction or adverse event following immunization. We're in a very different world than we were in the 50s and 60s. We have these huge real world data sources of electronic healthcare records in many countries, not all, but in terms of available for drug safety, but in many. So how do we think about optimizing their use, and maybe therefore the way that we analyze and think about spontaneous reports is time for a major rethink. And we, as Phil said, we think about how we can make data available for analysis using more sophisticated modern technologies. And also, as Florence says, maybe some types of reports, we need to think about doing things differently. Obviously, so there are scientific issues. I think there are issues around data privacy and how that works. So lots of issues to think through. And I'm not trying to, for a moment, suggest all of this is easy. But if we don't tackle the big, hard, challenging questions and try and do better for patient safety, we won't get there. So we have to really think about these sorts of questions. I do want to just take an opportunity, because I forgot to mention it earlier. I do want to again thank John, Vijay, and the rest of the authorship, because it may sound like quite a simple study or relatively simple study reading it, but it was incredibly hard to design it. And all of the detailed analytic planning to enable this appropriate comparison across different databases was really challenging. So just a big thanks to the whole team, because they did a brilliant job on it. I just wanted to add that. So yes, I think there are lots of things. I think we chip away at some of the easier issues, and I think we need to look at the bigger issues and be science driven. How do we do even better for patients?
Thanks so much, Andrew. And that's a good segue, because at this point, we will invite our presenters, John and Vijay, to join the panelists, and we'll move into another section where we will take some questions from the audience. And I see that we're getting a number of good questions, so we'll get right to that. The first question that I see is, I'm going to ask John and Vijay to take this together. The question is, can unique safety reporting IDs, such as worldwide unique ID numbers, be used to study or address the problem of ICSR replication? If so, how, and are there any limitations?
John, do you want me to take a stab at this one?
Yeah, I can start off because actually in the paper we did use the unique worldwide IDs for a portion of our study, in the sense that we looked between the participating companies what the extent was of replicated worldwide unique IDs. So you can also, of course, estimate the the extent of replication of these reports between the marketing authorization holders. So we have some limited results there, but it's definitely something that is that allowed us to do an additional study. I believe that the overlap between 2 of the 3 participating companies was as high as 20%. Don't quote me on that. I will have to quickly look at the paper unless Vijay has a number ready. But yes, that unique ID can certainly be used. We did use it for a limited part of our study. If, of course, I believe the user, what is the user of the question is hinting at, could you actually trace this worldwide unique ID through its various databases where it ends up? That was indeed one of the things we had planned to do. Where does this ID go? It goes to MHRA. MHRA maybe goes to EMA, or maybe, depending on the product, to other interested parties. So yes, it's a very interesting concept. We only did a small part of that study, but it can definitely be exploited. I don't know, Vijay, if you have additional numbers from our paper.
I do, John. So it actually ranged from 13% to 27% overlap in terms of worldwide case IDs. An additional component to note is that if you analyze worldwide case IDs of a particular marketing authorization holder or a company, you're ultimately looking at a snapshot, i.e. you're looking at a node within that transmission network. So whilst we can kind of say where a case has come from, tracing back, utilizing the worldwide case IDs, we have no idea where the future transmissions will be and transmissions thereafter, because we would send it on to health authorities and they would then transmit that case further. So it provides just a snapshot in time as to where a case has been.
Thanks very much to both of you. Now, this is a question that has come in from the audience, and I'm going to put this to you, Phil, if you don't mind. The question is, does the panel think that direct regulator-to-regulator transmission of ICSRs, along with a requirement for marketing authorization holders to not transmit the cases they got from regulatory authorities to other regulatory authorities, significantly solve the problem?
Yeah, and I think potentially it could. It's a great question and a great thing for all of us to consider. Clearly, if the burden of retransmission of data was passed to the health authorities, then we would be in a much better position, in the absence of a single either distributed database or a single source of truth. We would be in a much better position to control exactly what we wanted from other countries' data. And I think, I say that because partly sometimes we will receive reports out of ICSR that appear out of annual publications in a specific country that are really records of incidents that have happened, rather than anything that is adding value to us from a pharmacovigilance perspective. And I think we would be able to have a much more sensible conversation around what data we actually wanted to share between authorities. So I think that is definitely an interesting area to explore, and certainly something that we would be keen to consider. Of course, the complexity with that is that there is a legal basis for reporting and changing the law, whether it's in the UK or in Europe or the US, is a very significant undertaking. It takes quite substantial time, but it may be that there's opportunities for us to pilot different approaches and to consider, through MOUs, whether we can improve case retransmission in the short term to look at things. So these are definitely topics that are worth exploring in our discussions.
Thanks very much, Phil. Florence, this question came in from the audience during your comments on literature specifically. It's a hypothetical example. Let's say that there are 500 marketing authorization holders marketing the drug. Essentially, there are 500 different versions created. Most of the time, while analyzing EVDA's data, it is found that these are not only duplicates of each other, but they have different ADRs. Can this be avoided?
I think it's a very good question, and something from my own experience working with a national database that we see a lot. So it actually does happen that when we're analyzing data, that we see that there's a generic product for which a publication was made, and that we see that same report coming into the database from multiple marketing authorization holders, but also that they report not on all the same cases in that literature report. And we've had events when there's a table with 70 patients in an article that all get reported, but not everyone reports on the same patients. And that is such an enormous puzzle for us then to see what the cases actually are. And I think the only way to really solve this is look at obligations for the legal requirements for reporting those literature reports. But before that is fixed, I think a very practical thing would be to be as clear as possible when you are making a report itself on what patients from that literature report you are reporting. So try to be as clear as possible what patient from that literature report you are putting in your ICSR, because well, my experience is that it's very puzzling sometimes what people take out of a literature report and what they then send in as an ICSR. And I think that could be avoided in many cases.
Thank you, Florence. Thanks for taking on the hypothetical. Andrew, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I do. I just wanted to add really a kind of a slight challenge really for our participants. You know, I think we were excited to conduct this study. You know, we found the results very interesting, and it's you know, gratifying to hear Phil and Florence feel similarly. I think, and there are, you know, loads of great ideas, but I think I would slightly throw this down as a gauntlet to the field and all of you out there. We have some ideas. You're hearing some great ideas on how we can move this forward. This is a here and now pharmacovigilance challenge, and I think we need everybody on the call helping us come up with some ideas. And I mean ideas plural, because I think someone said we're going to probably have to, as a field, test some alternatives, see what works, see what we can do. There may be short-term solutions that are easy to implement, and then more creative, longer-term challenges that are going to take far more scientific evidence and potentially, as Phil was alluding to, legislative change in terms of how, you know, data, for example, is pulled rather than pushed. I think we all have in common that all PV organizations want to have access to data that can impact benefit risk and be able to see those reports in as much detail as possible where they have potential to impact benefit risk. How do we as a field do better? And I think it's great to hear these ideas from all of the team. I would also throw that out there to all of you who are watching this to please do share your ideas. And I believe, Clint, you may have a mailbox you'll show at some point that people can send in thoughts and ideas for how we take this forward, both within TransCelerate in terms of scientific experimentation, but also perhaps outside in other fora. You know, I think that this is, I hope, the start of this is a question rather than an answer that we're triggering today, that we as a group need to collaborate on to progress how we get to a place where we can do things better in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Absolutely. We'll share that mailbox shortly. I want to go back up to one of the first questions that we received today. And John, this is for you. Why is it needed to copy a case rather than just link to the one original ICSR? Is it the same information, but only metadata changes?
Well, that's a brilliant suggestion hidden in the form of a question, I think, because of course we are creating copies. The participant really got the idea, and that is the way that the global PV system is set up. We are deliberately creating these copies, and indeed, if we could just refer back to a version, a canonical version, whether it sits in a distributed database or in the original database where it came from, whether that be a health authority, marketing authorization holder. That is the trick. How do you do that from a technical point of view? This could be one other approach to indeed creating an improved PV ecosystem. So I thank the participants for this additional suggestion. And that's what Andrew was just talking about. Can we come up with potential approaches that will resolve some of the issues observed? And this may be yet another one of these ideas. Yes, indeed.
Yeah. And just to comment on that, Clint, I think, this is a joint problem, right, John? I mean, this is not, we don't view this as an industry specific challenge. We don't see this as a regulator's, Phil and Florence, you've talked about from your organization's perspective as a challenge for you. And I think the way we're going to solve this as an ecosystem is by collaborating, because it's a problem for everybody in pharmacovigilance, these sorts of copies of reports flying around the place.
Thanks, Andrew. Phil, I'm going to bring it back over to you for another audience question. This is a question to MHRA. I assume that's you. Especially for generic organizations. MHRA wants them to download cases from MHRA database, which may or may not be their drug. These cases are further reported to partners worldwide, health authorities except MHRA. This happens with almost every generic organization who is marketing a drug in the UK. Can this replication be avoided?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is certainly not just an MHRA problem. I think you see exactly the same issue in other databases. There's a few different things that I'd like to pick up on this. So firstly, Florence was making a point around the differences that we see in individual cases. I've certainly seen cases reported to us where one company, where there's maybe 3 drugs that appear to be suspect drugs reported by the primary source. One company will remove 2 of those and make them co-suspect. Another company will include 3 of those drugs as suspect. Another company will include a different one as suspect. And of course, all of those then look like different cases and get retransmitted to different organizations. So I think there's a first principle around, if something has been reported by a primary source in a particular way, then that is how it needs to be reflected in the database. Now, of course, there are requirements around causality that need to be followed, and there may be considerations which companies will have depending on their own products and so on. But I think amendment of cases by organizations that have not received the data from the primary source is problematic. I think also we have a responsibility for whoever is collecting the data to be as precise in relation to the product as we can be. And for us, historically, and I think we can do better than this, but historically, this has relied on someone selecting a product from a list. Now, if someone's selecting, I used paracetamol earlier, so I'll stick with it. If someone simply selects paracetamol because that's what they know that they've had, that means that we don't have precision on what product was taken, and we don't really have a choice other than to provide that to all of the companies who may need to take a risk-benefit decision based on that case. Clearly, that's extremely unlikely in the case of paracetamol. However, if we were able to enable barcode scanning or recognition of the product from the electronic healthcare record in the case of prescribed products, for instance, then we would have the ability to only send those reports to the organization who was responsible for that specific drug. I do think there's a wider conversation from a signal detection perspective around where the right responsibility for signal detection sits, because in my paracetamol example, I suspect, although whilst the legal responsibility is for cases that are your specific product or that you cannot exclude, actually any paracetamol product is likely to have the same issues. And certainly, even when we look at innovative products, we will always be considering whether there is a reflection to other products of the same nature. And so I think there's a completely separate discussion from a signal detection perspective around how we can do better in signal detection in relation to not just our own data, but the broader set of data that is available. And actually some of the approaches that have been described by John, Vijay, Andrew and others start to touch on how can we stop focusing on retransmission of cases and start focusing more on signal detection activities that impact patients. And that's where we want to be. So I think all of these paths lead in sort of the same direction. But yeah, again, it's a great point. I think there's steps that all of us can take on our different sort of sides of the fence to help reduce that burden.
Thank you, Phil. We are watching the clock. We're getting a lot of good questions from the audience, so thank you for this. We may only have time for one more. And Florence, this one looked interesting. I wonder if you would be willing to answer it. The question is, do you think that linked cases, such as pregnancy exposures that result in both a mother and baby case, cause additional issues when it comes to handling replication?
Another very good question. Yeah, I think it could lead to issues, yes, because if you replicate it and then only replicate the child case, for instance, and yeah, it could, in my opinion, I think it could lead to more divergence of information. Yeah, because it's a linked case. So probably it would lead to more issues than for normal cases which are not linked.
Thanks, Florence. We are coming up toward the end now. So what I would like to do is I'd like to thank all the panelists and presenters for their time today. So we are nearing the top of the hour. Unfortunately, that means the end of this webinar. But we want to mention that you can contact us via email with any feedback or additional questions you may have. We also would like to solicit your thoughts, as Andrew mentioned earlier. And so we want to remind you of the links that are available on your handout. We'll pause for a moment so that you can look at that, and also so that you can note the mailbox that you can communicate with us on. There's also a link, if you go to our website, there is a tab called Engage with Us. Please find your way to that. There'll also be a way to contact us in that way. We encourage you to consider registering for our next public webinar or sharing that information with a colleague. The webinar will be titled Offering Choice to Patients, an overview of the personalized clinical trials framework. And this webinar will be held on Thursday, November the 2nd at 9 o'clock Eastern Time. That's 9 a.m. So with that, I'd like to thank again our panelists, our presenters. I'd like to thank all of you, the audience, for taking your time to join us. We hope that you enjoyed today's program, and please keep in touch with us. Thank you.
Thank you.